Hello, it's Aaron Wren. Welcome back to the show. Today's guest is Joshua Klein. He is the editor-in-chief of Mortise and Tenon Magazine, which is a magazine about traditional wood construction, especially furniture. He's also a fellow in mechanical arts at the Greystone Theological Institute. Now, the magazine's website is mortiseandtenonmag.com. There's a link to that in the show notes, and there's also a link to Greystone in the show notes. Joshua, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
I found out about this magazine because someone knows I'm a magazine guy. I love magazines. I love going to, Brooklyn, New York, or wherever, going to the magazine store and finding like really cool stuff. And so somebody said you should check this magazine out, and I bought a copy, and I'll hold it up here so you do know that I actually have the physical magazine. I'm not just making this up, and it is beautiful. And we'll put up some images for that in a little bit. But really aesthetically, just I love the photography, the composition, and the actual articles are great. It sort of got me interested in the topic, even though traditionally I've not really had a lot of manual skills, to say the least. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I hear a lot of people talk about mortise and tenon construction, if I pronounce that correctly, but what actually is it? What actually is it?
Yeah. Basically, the mortise and tenon joint, the reason I've named the publication that is because the mortise and tenon joint is the most basic form of joinery that has been used throughout history. So it's the way that you join two pieces of wood at right angles. So your table, and you have the table legs and you have the rails that come across. Those are hopefully joined together with the mortise and tenon joint. And so the tenon is the protrusion or the tongue on the rail. So it's the male member that fits into a corresponding hole, the mortise. And so these two pieces of wood are with sawing and paring with chisels, you can shape these two mating components together so that they fit just snugly enough that it's tight, but not too tight to break. And then this can last, for centuries. Ancient Egyptian furniture pulled out of tombs is still assembled, still standing with this basic joint. So it's been a staple, not only for furniture, but also for house construction, up until relatively recently with the development of, 2x4s. And then now, 1.5, but, we have this nominal 2x4. So the mortise and tenon joint is the most basic form for all sorts of putting sticks together, putting timbers together. This is what you would use.
I've assembled some flat pack furniture and other things in my day, and everything today seems to assemble with brackets or with screws or things like that. There aren't a lot of joints that you're kind of assembling. How was sort of pre-industrial wood construction? What are some of the differences between the way we used to make things and the way we make things today?
Yeah. Well, there's the joinery question, and then there is also the question of it's sort of a paradigm difference. It's sort of how's the medieval world different from the modern world? I mean, how isn't it different, right? So that applies to all of the material artifacts as well, the crafts as well. But in terms of the joinery, you're right that a lot of modern artifacts, a lot of objects that we find are joined together with fasteners primarily, maybe brackets in addition to fasteners. Adhesives are very common. Now we've long had fasteners and adhesives, but to use those in lieu of joinery is what's new, or to use those as our joinery is what's new, and it doesn't last. You're not going to find. You're not going to pull a piece of IKEA furniture out of a 5,000-year-old tomb and say, "Hey, it's still standing." I mean, it's just not the same thing. Epoxy is going to fail eventually, and so there's a big difference between wooden formed mechanical joints in the past, how it has been done until relatively recently, and then this sort of adhesive and fastener way. Of course, though, it is still possible to do these things. That's what we're celebrating in the magazine. That is still possible to do this. It's sort of like Wooden Boat magazine, if you're familiar with that. That's actually in my neighborhood as well. And it's the same idea. People can still make wooden boats, even though there are other forms of boating available. So yeah, that's the big difference. But then what that means is when you start getting into exploring, how do you go about this? How does this process happen? You enter into another world. You start thinking about your materials differently, because now you're not forming the joinery with machinery, because the machinery needs the stock to be exactly flat and square. And so when you look at old furniture, you realize none of it is flat or square, because it didn't need to be that way for joining the wood together. And then you start getting into, well, then how do you work this material with just hand tools? So again, it's like entering into a whole nother paradigm of thinking about the way you do your work and how you approach it. And it very much is a difference between a pre-industrial craftsmanship mentality and an industrial craft mentality. It's possible to approach woodworking with hand tools with an industrial mentality, and to miss the whole paradigm, to miss how it all goes together. So I think that's what we're trying to emphasize in the magazine, is to hold that up and show that there is a big difference, and it's not just the tool you're holding in your hand, but it's a whole paradigm shift.
When I think about buildings that were built prior to like the modern era, like how much labor must have been involved in that? Because you have to cut down the tree, then you have to, with presumably an axe or maybe some type of a saw. I don't know when the saw was invented. Then you have to shape that into, a piece of timber, like a board with, I guess, an axe and then a plane, some kind of a plane or something, or whatever you call it, to do it. Then you have to have these like hand drills to drill all the holes to put stuff together. And you have to have, you don't exactly have a level to level everything. So you have to have techniques for leveling, I guess, using plumb lines or something.
Yep.
And this has got to be like everything that we do today with like my DeWalt impact driver and circular saws and all the lumber that you just buy at the lumber yard or at Lowe's or Home Depot. People had to do by hand.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of crazy to think about what that was like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so when I actually started Mortise and Tenon almost 10 years ago, coming up on 10 years, one of the things that I was fascinated with was this difference in process, because I was actually restoring antique furniture and taking this stuff apart to restore it, and said, wow, how do you even accurately work with such rough insides? Nothing's flat or square, nothing's even, nothing's regular. What do you reference off of? How do you make something nice and neat looking? And that was intriguing to me. And so, yeah, so I started to think about that, and then compare that to the historic records, the few records we have of shop time and what things were charged. You have a day's labor, and you can start figuring out how long did it take them to do this. And the time that it took these guys blows our minds. We can't even really process, we can't think through, how did they do that so fast? Even if they had machines, we're not even as fast, it seems sometimes. And so that really was intriguing to me. Say, okay, maybe there's something deficient in our understanding of how to use these tools. It's not the tools themselves, but it's the techniques we're employing to use them well. Because these, when you look at any antique furniture, if you go to a museum, and these museums, maybe if you can see the back, if you can see the underside, you will see rough surfaces on the inside, right? Because they're trying to expedite the work. No one was going to see that. And so that's an invitation with all those tool marks left behind. It's like, footprints in the snow to go chase down and say, to kind of unpack the process. How did they get to this? What were they doing to go through these steps? And that sort of journey began for me as a question of efficiency. How can you be efficient doing this kind of work? In the 21st century, using hand tools, yeah, right. That's clearly impractical. But then these artifacts were proving otherwise, that it actually can be efficient. Now, as I've gone through this and discovered efficient techniques, you can look at 1920s films. There are these 1920s films from Sweden and different things, and cabinet makers working, and they are hustling. They are moving very efficiently. Every stroke, every cut is exactly dialed in. That's the key to efficiency. But what I started realizing is, I think that not many people get into this because they want to maximize their efficiency. Not many people today get into woodworking because they want to be that. And so efficiency is not the ultimate driver for me. That's not the primary interest. But when we look at those records, we realize there's something about the embodied knowledge, the hand knowledge, that is what's so intriguing, not necessarily the tools themselves.
How widespread were these skills? I think about pioneers who went to the Midwest or, Indiana, where I live, and they had to build their own house.
Yep.
And they had metal, so they had nails. I don't know when the nail was invented or how long. Probably nails have been around a long time, but like nails were precious.
Yeah.
They would say, you hear these stories like when people would move, they would burn down their house so they could collect all the nails and take them with them to build their new house where they were going. That's how precious the metal was. But, presumably the husband built the thing, maybe with some help from others, and furniture would have been done by specialists. But how widespread was the knowledge and the tooling of how to do this stuff?
Well, I think, so some of it is somewhat of a wealth question. If you had the wealth to hire someone, that would be how it would often be done. But not that many people had that kind of wealth. And so I think one way to kind of frame our thinking about this is to think, fast forward 100 years or whatever, and self-driving cars, right? And those people are going to be asking, well, how many people actually had the skill to drive cars? To like navigate all the traffic and to see all the pedestrians, and like, how did they even do that? How many people actually knew how to drive cars? Well, pretty much most adults, right, know how to drive cars. And we think of it as completely unremarkable. It's just a basic skill. But when you learned how to drive, you know how complicated that was. Well, so if we think back to a time when there wasn't such a commodity focused culture, when we were thinking about purchasing all of our stuff, but we had these simple tools that we learned from the generations before us. To make a chair, to make a table, to frame up an addition, to build a house really was unremarkable. It wasn't that big of a deal. Now, that doesn't mean everybody was, a master craftsman, that everything was very, very precise. But everybody, it was kind of a basic skill, a basic competence in woodworking was just sort of in the water, sort of presumed. But that hand skill was not only just for woodworking, but it was all sorts of crafts. People knew how to use their bodies. They knew how to build things. They knew how to farm. They knew how to do a lot of things. And, the literature that makes fun of the wealthy people who are, incompetent, can't do things, that was pretty rare. There were a lot of people who were really doing a lot of things that even Thoreau, right, this academic Thoreau, felt no hesitation to go out into the woods, borrow an axe, and hew a little timber frame. Not that big of a deal. He romanticized it. He talked about how great it was, but it wasn't something that he envisioned as, out of reach. So it was quite common, I think.
There's a Isaac Asimov science fiction short story. I think it's called The Feeling of Power, where in a future society, everyone has forgotten how to do math. All math is done by computers. And no one believes it's possible for a human being to manually calculate something. And somebody discovers how to do it. And they don't believe it. Like, this can't be real. I mean, humans can't do math. Yeah. So I can see something like that actually coming to pass. One of the things that really did intrigue me, I'm intrigued by the magazine in general, but the fact that, you teach at a theological institute in mechanical arts, and that you're actually an elder in a Presbyterian church. You're part of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church denomination. And, I'm a Presbyterian as well. When I think about Presbyterians, I tend to think of people who are more intellectual, more white collar. And the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, he wrote his book, A Secular Age. And he talked about the Reformation, about Calvinism in particular, as what he called an excarnating faith. That it sort of took the physical dimensions of Christianity away from it, and it became much more about the attitudes of the heart and the propositions of the mind. And he wasn't necessarily talking about building things in that. But it's interesting that you do this as a sort of kind of Presbyterian Reformed theology guy, but now you're also very much into the kind of the manual arts and these sort of things. So I'm curious, how does maybe your interest in preserving and utilizing these techniques relate to Christianity and Reformed theology?
Yeah. I think you're right that, that critique of not only maybe Christianity in general, but, especially we're talking about the Reformed faith and that sort of tradition as being so heavenly minded, we're no earthly good, or maybe a little egg-headed, or, our heads are in the clouds and not really so much interested in manual things. That critique is, I think, to a certain degree accurate. I do think, however, that within the Reformed tradition, there is a lot of, I don't think it was Calvin's preoccupation, right? I don't think a lot of reformers spent a lot of time thinking about, man, we really need to get people working with their hands again. And so that wasn't obviously a dominant issue in their thinking.
It wasn't a problem back then either.
It was not a problem. But I do think that there is so much in the Reformed faith that is ripe in good soil for this sort of, as I've been kind of working on over the years, moving toward a theology of craftsmanship within the Reformed vein of thought that is so helpful. And I think part of it is, of course, no surprise, vocation, right? A Protestant notion of vocation and the ennobling of manual arts, the ennobling of the milkmaid, that God milks the cow through the milkmaid. And Luther's concept of what work is, that work is a calling, and that it is a way to serve the community and to bind together again, to knit together in love through work, that work is service. And I think that's a really good starting place to think about, okay, so what we're doing throughout the week is not, irrelevant or even, less than in an important sense. It's actually part of the way we are called to serve. If we're created in Christ Jesus, if we're for God's workmanship, we're created in him for good works, to serve in love. Therefore, that involves hands and eyes and mouths and doing things, right? Therefore, it's relevant. And so the work of our hands is something that we are called to be busy with. But also when we think about the cultural mandate, the call to shape the world, to better and beautify it, to work these things, to be exercising dominion in a godly way, that is a call to do good work, right? So we're called to think about these sorts of things. And then also, as Kuyper developed his ideas of this sort of transformationalist vision, whether you're a neo-Calvinist or not, however you want to think about those things, there is this cultural mandate, this call to shape things. All of this is within Reformed thinking and is really fruitful. But I think that the thing that I have been focused on the last few years in my research and with Greystone, as we've been talking about a lot of these things, that there's a piece of theology that I think is not quite tapped into enough, and that is partly it's a translation issue, and it's because we miss the fact that the word for craftsmanship or skill in Hebrew is the same word for wisdom. So wisdom is skill. It's the same word. And so when Solomon is exercising wisdom, he's exercising skill. The sailors in the Psalms who are at their wits' end, they're at the end of their skill, their ability, at their wits, wisdom. It's the same word. And so when we think about skill or craftsmanship as a form of wisdom, that then I think is an invitation to think about the connections of those things. That wisdom is not only just knowing the prescriptions, knowing the law, but it's also, as Proverbs shows us, attending to the world, paying attention to the particularities of the situation and knowing what is the right application, whether we should or should not answer the fool according to his folly in this given moment. That requires wisdom. And that is what craftsmanship is. It's knowing not only what is good and beautiful, but attending to the material, attending to your tools, and appropriately applying at that moment the skill you have to make that judgment call and do what needs to be done there. That's the heart of craftsmanship. And I think that's been a fruitful way to think about Reformed theology and Christian theology in general, and developing a theology of craftsmanship. I think that's one of the more fruitful paths that I've been on for a while. And I think that we'd all do well to meditate on that and think those things through.
is there some theological motivation to prefer sort of traditional craftsmanship over industrial production? I mean,
Um,
what's your view, kind of the modern
yeah.
industrial landscape?
Yeah. So I would not make a case that, I'm not an Anabaptist, right? I'm not
Hmm.
Amish, right? I'm not saying, okay, so I'm not equating technology and AI with Satan, so that the prince of the power of the air,
Hmm.
right? We're not equating that. But what I do think is fascinating when you're thinking about craftsmanship as the exercise of judgment, skill, care, you're paying attention, you have to make judgment calls in the moment, then what that's already calling you to is a form of work that is attentive to the particulars, as I've said. So what that starts to do is the technological move is against that. Technology is a disburdenment, right? It's taking something, applying an apparatus or a device to a situation to disburden you from having to make the judgment call, right? So we're separated from the work getting done. That's the technological direction. It's to distance the user or the maker from the artifact. And so craftsmanship actually moves the other direction. If you want to be successful, say carving a spoon with a knife, you can't distance yourself from it. You have to get deeper into it. You have to pay
Hmm.
closer attention. And so I think that in terms of the theological significance, if we want to learn wisdom, we need to approach, uh, let's say, in a counseling situation or an interpersonal conflict in your family or something. You don't want to technologize that. You don't want to come up with some sort of jig to fix the problem that you can kind of step away from and say, okay, fix that. You actually need to engage it like a craftsman. You actually need to get in closer, be very attentive, say, now this person, why is she responding this way? And so I think that's what's really fruitful about it is learning craftsmanship, learning the crafts. It's teaching you to pay attention. Like, Solomon, pay attention, consider the ant. Consider the ant. What value is there in that?
Hmm.
Well, pay attention and you'll see. And so I think that's the theological import.
I have a lot more questions, but I'm going to take a brief pause in the conversation because I want to show people some of the magazines. So I have some images queued up. And so for those of you who are listening on the audio version, you won't see this. You might want to click over to the YouTube and get to about 23 minutes in to check it out. But I'm going to throw up this cover. I mean, this is what I mean by a completely beautiful cover. I mean, incredible composition. I don't know if that's an axe or if it's a special
Mhm.
name for that.
Yeah,
That's
it's a
that's
broad
just
axe for hewing timbers.
oh wow. So that's a great one. I also love this um, uh, view of span that a little bit, and just again beautiful cover art. Um, then there's this one, and I might just stop on this one because it's got some tools. This is a cover of the magazine with what looks like 3 different tools on it. Could you just tell us what these tools are?
Yeah. So this particular issue, this cover, we have an article in this issue about Japanese woodworking. So what you're looking at on the cover there, it's actually 2 tools. That there's a chisel. You can see the chisel. That's pretty clear. But the other 2 objects are to be put together, and that's a Japanese hand plane called so there's the wooden body, which is the kana, and then there's the blade. It's called on the left there. So that fits down into the bed, the mouth. You see the white down through the mouth, and the iron. And in the Western tradition, we call it an iron, but in Japanese planes, they call it a blade. The blade fits down into the bed. So on all of our covers of our magazine, we want to feature prominently. We have this our thing is the white background with some shavings and dust, and then featuring some aspect of an article from that issue, a tool, some hands working with a tool that's featured in the issue. So what we want to do is it's a very stark modern presentation, and I was actually inspired by when you go to a museum and they have the white background, right? All the neutral colors, and then you have this hand-hewn artifact on display featured. It accentuates, it brings out all of the tool marks and the facets, and all of the handwork is right there on display. And that's what these covers are doing. And that's what the whole magazine design is about accentuating, featuring, helping you to see the handmade qualities of all these things.
Yeah, it's definitely got a slick kind of modern design. Obviously, it like inspired by like the old kinfolk type aesthetics and things like
Yeah,
that. Very
sure.
good, but it's an interesting juxtaposition. I guess a little bit like the early kinfolk of sort of kind of traditional aesthetic, traditional processes, and sort of contemporary. So it's not ye old woodworking like
Mm,
you might imagine with like a deliberately like retro style, like it was the Saturday Evening Post or something.
right.
It looks
Exactly.
great, by the way. I mean, I really like it.
Thank you.
I
Thank
also
you.
appreciate, as you mentioned Japanese, that what you're talking about here, and there was also some stuff on Japanese craftsmanship in the issue that I have, is this is not an American or even a European phenomenon that like lots of societies across the world use many of the same techniques and common tools. I don't know if they were inspired by each other or if it was just the nature of the work, but this is like a global multicultural phenomenon.
Absolutely. And that's the thing that I think, so, we talk about pre-industrial
Yeah.
woodworking. And that has tripped up some people in the woodworking world. That seems like such a niche, and I guess it is, but it's such an obscure thing to focus on. But within the world of woodworking and woodworking publishing, I think a lot of people would assume, oh, you're talking about like colonial woodworking, like Colonial Williamsburg and that sort of
Yeah.
thing. I love Colonial Williamsburg, and I have great friends there, and I appreciate that. I'm not at all, throwing shade on Colonial Williamsburg, but people think that what we're trying to do is a historic reenactment sort of thing until they see the publication and they realize, oh, that's not at all what you guys are doing. But I live in New England, and so that's my frame of reference. Those are the artifacts I see. That's the tradition I'm used to. But my interest is not about so much this particular region at all. My interest is in pre-industrial craftsmanship, non-mechanized ways of working. And that exists all over the world, of course, as you said, and it doesn't stop at a particular year, right? It's not like we're interested in 18th century woodworking or 13th century or whatever. We are interested in this transmission of craft knowledge and how it has been passed down through generations all over the world. And so we ran an article on Taiwanese plane making a hand plane in Taiwan. And this guy's still making hundreds of these things by hand with a chisel, and so this stuff still exists. I'm calling it pre-industrial, but these things still exist in pockets of the world. And we want to, hold that up and celebrate that and say, that's amazing. We've actually started a research grant program to facilitate more research around the world. And we've, had people travel around the world to go study this niche topic so that they can publish about it. So we can hold these things up and see the beauty of them.
Yeah. I'll throw up one more cover there. Another just gorgeous, the way that it works, and throw up an interior shot. Again, you can see the same sort of aesthetic interior. The photography is incredible. This is all original photography you do then?
Yep. Yeah, we do our own photography. There are, some of our authors will supply some of their own photography, but we do our own photography. It's a very kitchen table publication. I started it on my kitchen table and just me and my laptop. And now I have my good friend Mike working with me, and my good friend Grace does all the administrative stuff. So it's just the three of us plugging away here, and really enjoying this small scale business and small scale publishing. It's a blessing to be able to utilize things like Shopify and the Adobe Creative Cloud, software and all that kind of stuff. So we're not anti-technology at all. We're not anti-technology, but we see these things as supportive, elements of the world and not dominating elements of the world. So I'm very delighted. I'm so blessed to be able to live in this time, to be able to publish and celebrate these sorts of things utilizing these digital technologies.
So you're also the designer of the magazine?
Yes. Yep.
Right, so that's like you're doing Adobe InDesign or something on the
Yes.
on part of the day, and then the other part of the day you're getting out your plane and your axe and
Absolutely. half of our year is at the bench, half of our year is, doing editorial work. That is very important to us to maintain that 50-50 balance. We love, academic rigor. We love reading. We love working through editorial things, doing research, and we love having our sleeves rolled up and making shavings. And I wouldn't want to give up either one of them.
Yeah. Again, the URL is mortiseandtenonmag.com. There is a link in the show notes. I'll put up one more, which is your book Joined, which is, I don't have a link to buy that, so people would have to look that up. But you do have a book as well, similar aesthetic there.
Yeah, so I've written a few different books, and this particular one, Joined, it's an introduction. I call it a bench guide to furniture joinery. So one of the things that's distinctive about Mortise and Tenon is that we are not simply replicating or doing again all over again the woodworking magazine tutorial format. So it's not that our articles are just tutorial, that we just say step 1, step 2, step 3, here's how you do this thing. What ends up happening with that is you have to kind of go on a publishing cycle, because there are only so many forms and so many techniques, and you end up kind of regurgitating the same sort of information. But we're actually much more interested in, if we're doing a build article, it's more of a narrative format. So we are describing what we're doing, but it's it's an exploration almost. We're going through a project and puzzling our way through. But then we also have a lot of philosophical pieces, interviews with people, and thinking about the relationship of living in an industrial technological society and what it means to work with our hands and that sort of thing. So a lot of our publication is more aimed at that direction. And so Joined, and then I have another book, Worked, and we have other material. We have online courses as well that are focused more on the how-to, the tutorial, guiding people through step process so that they can be equipped at the bench to do this too.
Well, this is great. I'm going to go back to our regularly scheduled programming here and take those off. But again, it's gorgeous. That'll give people a sense of what it is if they want to check it out. I'm curious to what extent your motivation for some of this. So are you... I feel like it's a mission to preserve a craft that's in danger of disappearing, or is it like, wow, this is cool, I'm energized by this? What is bringing people to want to do these sorts of things?
Yeah, my entry into this world was, I think, somewhat intuitive. I couldn't quite articulate what it was about it, but I just felt so drawn into it. And I think a lot of people can perhaps relate to that. I just want to get involved. I just want to put my hands to it, right? They can't really say what it is. And I've actually been very intrigued by that, and reading a lot of, sort of a philosophy of technology sort of stuff, and a lot of that kind of literature, and thinking also about how, what the value is of working with our hands. And among other people, there are all sorts of people I am very fond of, and I would love to cite and dive into that rabbit trail. But Albert Borgman is a philosopher of technology who passed away a couple of years ago now. But he wrote a book that was talking about the nature of technology and the way it functions in contemporary society. And he was talking about this device paradigm. And he said the device paradigm is kind of as I described, that we have a thing that can do the work for us, and that it separates us from it. And he is talking about and actually I think Matthew Crawford talks about Borgman as well. So if you're familiar with Shop Class's Soulcraft and Matt Crawford and his writing, he's building off of other people as well, but Borgman's insights too. So Crawford's call to agency is very, very similar to this. But Borgman, instead of latching onto the word agency, similarly, Borgman latches onto this concept of engagement, right? It's a very similar idea, a call to engage. I want to be involved with this. I want to participate in it. I want to, as I said, the carving the spoon, get in closer and understand how this works and get better at doing it. And whether you're, planting a garden because you want to know how food is grown and be involved with it, or you want to go surfing or mountain climbing or whatever the thing is, woodworking is that. And so I think that's what drew me into it, and that's what draws so many people into it, even if they can't articulate that. A lot of our readers, a lot of our of the people we talk to are actually in IT. They're computer programmers. They're living their lives in front of screens, and they are desperate for something else. They want to be able to make something. They want to be able to have something in their hands, tangible, shape it, and then actually use the thing. So surfing probably is fun, but when you put that surfboard away, that's a memory, right? But when you're a woodworker and you've spent the time in the shop engaging the wood and the tool, you have something to bring home and to share and to, even pass down to your children. And I think that's what draws a lot of us into it, is that it's this invitation to participate in the world.
How many people are involved in this? Like, how big is the community of people, would you estimate?
It depends on how narrowly you want to, think about this. So there is, especially no surprise here in 2020, there was a lot of interest in, gardening and sourdough bread baking and all that kind of stuff. So there are a lot of people with renewed interest. And I think, of course, some of that interest has waned as people moved on. But I was delighted to see how many people actually really wanted to take up some sort of craft or some sort of making. But in terms of woodworking, I do think woodworking was riding that interest as well. When I started Mortise and Tenon almost 10 years ago, it was in the midst of a developing, it was beginning to get underway, this hand tool renaissance, people were calling it, in the woodworking world. Now, woodworking is a small niche of our culture, and then the hand tool woodworking is even smaller. And I know, it's not, I don't think of it as like a purist culture. It's not a purist sort of thing. We're not the Puritans of woodworking. But it is a niche, a segment of woodworking. But this hand tool renaissance was really gaining ground. It really was taking off. And there are not only a few small publishers republishing material and writing new books about using hand tools, but also there are a lot of tool makers as well, which is very important, obviously. If we have been disconnected as a society from working with our hands, what has happened then is the tool manufacturers are no longer interested, of course, in making high quality tools, right? And so that when we were thinking about hand tool woodworking, a lot of those manufacturers just let those tools either go altogether, or they went the way of Stanley, and the stuff you would buy from the big box store is what we call a tool shaped object. It's not actually really a functional tool in many regards. So what's happened with this hand tool renaissance is a huge explosion of blacksmiths and tool makers. It's usually one person or a few people working together, making small batches of really high quality tools, or even, Lee Nielsen Tool Works, Lee Valley Tool Works. There are all these different companies that are a little bit bigger even, that because of the interest, there's a growing interest in making high quality tools. And now there is no more excuse for anyone to say, well, they're just like, you can't get those tools anymore. Now, all that to say, I actually don't really have, I think, any new tools. All of my tools are at least 100 or 150 years old. I use antique tools, and that's a lot of my interest. So it's not that these tools are gone, it's that we need to learn how to, tune them up and use them properly. So it's a niche segment of the woodworking world, but I think it's quite strong and growing. And as more people are introduced to it, they're getting hooked. And part of our drive with Mortise and Tenon is to hook people, to hook you, Aaron. So you want to get a hand plane and say, well, I got to try this now.
Yeah. You sort of allude to boat building, to gardening, sourdough. It does seem like, probably going back 20 years. I mean, certainly the roots were deeper than that, but there's been this renaissance of artisanal craft of all varieties. You could think about the stereotypes of Brooklyn and having a lot of that. How related are these, and what do you see as sort of the underlying driver? Obviously, people have a lot more money today. We're wealthier, so we can afford to indulge higher cost pursuits. because it does cost. The thing is, it's like the quality thing actually does cost a lot more today. It may have been the cheap option originally, but it's the expensive option now. But like, what's driving? How related are these, and what's driving it?
Yeah. Yeah, that is really interesting. So it is when I started Mortise and Tenon, that was kind of underway a little bit, but now it's gotten, as you know, so out of control that everybody's got flannel and a leather apron and a beard, and everything is artisanal and everything Amazon, whatever that is, artisan Amazon or whatever. It's totally ridiculous. And so now
Mm-hmm.
there's this term, craft washing. It's like greenwashing, that
I haven't
there's
heard that one.
yeah. So craft washing is this basically marketing, taking the handmade artisanal marketing and then slapping that, layering that on top of, mass produced goods. And so, yeah. And I think that actually doesn't necessarily bother me, because if you think of it in terms of it's reflecting what people are interested in, then therefore I take heart. And I think a lot of if you go into a really cool coffee shop, you're going to see rough sawn old vintage boards screwed with sheetrock screws to the wall. I mean, that's pretty silly. However, what people are grasping for is something real, something tangible, something that reminds them that a person made this thing. And even if they don't have the particular craft knowledge, they don't know how to recognize tool marks and whatever. And so a lot of that, the industrial chic sort of look, I think it's not just that they love machinery. I mean, I don't think that, how can you sell hand cut cheese and hand shaken drinks and then be surrounded by machine made things, but they see the roughness and they think a person made this, right? And I think that's really important to latch onto, whether it's sourdough bread or whatever the thing is, or having backyard chickens. I mean, who would have seen backyard chickens coming back? But that is more and more common today. And I think that it is this desperation. People want to connect with things that are tangible, and they want to see how all this stuff works. They want to see how the world works. Where do eggs come from? How do you make a table? And I think it is hooking people that they do want to connect with these things.
You noted earlier that it was a lot of IT professionals doing this. And what I've noticed is the people who do these sorts of things are almost invariably now white collar type workers, highly educated people. And that's not 100% the case. There's a lot of Amish still doing things, but it seems like a lot of it is people who like went to college and maybe the knowledge worker creative class, if you will. Is this just a product of time and money, or is it a product of alienation from people's like soulless office jobs? What is your take on that phenomenon?
Yeah, I thank you for that question. I think that's a great question. I think it's interesting. I live in a rural area. I live in rural Maine,
Are
and
you
there are a
from
lot
there originally, by the way?
no, I actually grew up in Wisconsin, but my
Okay.
wife is from this area.
Okay.
I feel very much at home though in this area in rural Maine. And there are a lot of tradespeople around here. I mean, everybody's got their shingle hanging out. Everybody's got their own little business. They're all doing a lot of manual work. And they love it. But the thing that's interesting about it is it's different. I think what I would say the difference is a lot of people know how to do a whole lot of stuff in this area. I'm talking about this rural trades world, right? They know how to do a whole lot of stuff, but they're not going to write home about it. They're not going to write essays about it. They're not going to say, "Oh, this is so fulfilling." It's just how you do it, man. This is just how you live in the world. I'm not going to pay someone to do this. I'll fix it, right? It's unremarkable to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's pre-industrial. But when you're living in an industrial society, a technological society, that whole concept holds a mystique that is worth writing books about.
Yeah.
So, wow, people actually, you feel like you could just wire your own house? Like you could just do that? Like you could just build a little addition, or you could, learn to raise pigs? Like, is that actually possible? And so I think a lot of what you and I are seeing is not so much that only these people are interested in it, but I would say only these people are mystified by it and excited by it and really wanting desperately, teach me how to do this. And so when I have students come and I'm teaching them, a lot of people are surgeons or people working in offices who are not connected daily in their daily work to a lot of these kinds of hand skills. And so they're saying, I need to reconnect with these sorts of things. Now it's interesting because I've handed Crawford's shop classes Soulcraft to some tradespeople around here, and they're just not that interested. they're just like, well, whatever. I work 80 hours a week. I got stuff to do. I don't know what that guy's talking about. But they're embodying what Crawford is holding up, and I think that agency and that ability to just work.
If someone is interested in starting to do hand tool, woodcraft, how do you get started in that? What's the on-ramp to that?
Instagram. Just kidding. But what I'll say is the hand tool renaissance world is all over the place on the internet. There are resources, and actually the problem is that there are too many resources right now. And so obviously the crafts were passed down from generation to generation. All this stuff, and I think YouTube kind of helped, but let's say, your father never taught you how to change a tire on your car, right? And you opened a book that had a description of how to change a tire. You would feel you'd perhaps go, well, I don't really know how this, but as soon as someone just shows you, you go, oh, yeah, okay, I can do that. And that's how all craft knowledge is always transmitted. It's through mentorship. It's through imitation. You watch and then you work. And then you say, well, that doesn't look like what you just did. So you adapt and you engage yourself. You try to adjust. And so I think that a lot of this kind of thing is online. You can learn, but there has been somewhat of a disconnection. So there are books that are out there. There are videos all over online. But I think that is so much of what we have been trying to do with Mortise and Tenon is to try to focus our efforts, because you will get lost, of course, like everybody does. You will get lost in YouTube at just trying to figure your way out. But what we're trying to do at Mortise and Tenon is trying to get you going, trying to teach you how these tools work very basically so that you can start making shavings and be successful. So we've published, as I said, online courses and some of these tutorial books. But it's not because nobody else says anything about how to use these tools. It's that I think there's just too much. It's a glut of information. And one of the things that we've done is we've created an online apprenticeship program it's an 8-week program that we do once a year. And to sign up for the program, you're committing to 8 weeks of part-time work, working in your own shop, watching tutorials, doing homework, struggling through the assignments. Mike and I are available through the forums and we have 3 times a week video office hours. And that kind of thing, connecting with people, whether it's this kind of course or signing up for a woodworking class somewhere, that really is, I think, the most effective way to get in. So there's a paralysis by analysis, of course, that happens if you say, all right, I want to get into this, and you just start, I'm going to watch everything on YouTube I can. You will never make a shaving because you'll just be too overwhelmed. The way to learn something is to start. You just got to start. So find somebody who knows something, get one little course, do one little thing, and get started making shavings. Start small, and then you'll be able to, get some traction and move forward with this. And it's a slippery slope. It's addicting and a blast.
Yeah.
So.
To me, like, the thing that makes me intimidated by wanting to do something is the same intimidation factor around learning a foreign language, or say learning how to play the violin, which is to say, it takes a long time before you have the skills to do anything useful. It can take years of foreign language study before you can actually use that language in even the most minor way. How long do you have to work on gaining skills before you can do something useful?
There's the 10,000 hour rule that people talk about. To be a master of something, you have to invest 10,000 hours. that's to be a master. I think it really depends on what you're trying to do, but uh, and how much time you can devote to it. The other thing is one of the biggest hurdles that I've observed in the woodworking world, the market of readers. There are a lot of armchair woodworkers, very well-meaning. They love woodworking. They subscribe to all the magazines, and they have 2 or 3 of all of the tools. Huge shops full of tools, but they never make any shavings. And it's that paralysis sort of thing. But one of the things that I think is debilitating is when a person thinks, you know what, I just don't have the time. So what I'm going to do is, let's see, 2 Saturdays from now, I'm going to block out 6 hours and I'm going to be in the shop and I'm going to make a lot. And then guess what? Life happens. And that Saturday never comes. And so you never get in the shop. And then you multiply that by, 4 decades, and you still have a shop that's clean and full of tools. And that's, I think, a lot of people's story. That's the same thing that happens. So what we try to emphasize here is that if you're going to build any habit, right? There's people have been writing about habit formation. You don't say, what I'm going to do, I'm going to start a new habit. So in a month, I'm going to invest a long day and get really dedicated to this new habit I'm going to develop. No, you got to start a little bit at a time. It's about repetition, forming these patterns that become habits, deeply entrenched grooves, right? And so I think if we think of habit formation, then we can start to think about, what kind of trajectory we're on. So if you invest a few minutes a day, my wife teaches piano, right? Playing a musical instrument. Talk about engagement. Talk about, not mechanizing or technologizing. Playing a piano or playing a violin is an engaging thing. But my wife will tell her students, I'm not actually kidding. You really have to practice every day. If you cram for 2 hours right before your lesson once a week, it is not even close to as fruitful as if you do 10 minutes a day. That's all you got to do. And so I think the amount that you can put in on a regular basis really, really makes the difference. And that's like, with the apprenticeship program, as I mentioned, that's an 8-week program. And we have people starting in the program who have almost no experience working wood at all. And we give them the tool list and they're not sure what all those tools are, right? They have no experience. And at the end of this 8 weeks, through every day, small bits, working their way through in a slow methodology. And when you get through to the end of it, these people really are able to make a piece of furniture, a whole completed piece of furniture. They have dovetails and mortise and tenons, and they have dados and rabbets, and they've been planing, and they can take rough stock, they can fell a tree, they can split it, they can carve spoons, all sorts of stuff. Now, they're just beginning. They're just getting their feet under them, but they have these skills to build on. So it is possible, but it's all about how much time you can invest, and the regularity is the key.
Well, I can definitely relate to the temptation to buy tools. Every time I walk into the hardware store, I'm like, oh, that would be great to have one of those. But as a general rule, I almost never buy a tool unless I have a specific use for it. And then I buy the tool. And then I always have another need for it sometime in the future. I don't think I've ever bought a tool that I used just once.
Yeah.
So, well, that's great. Well, Joshua, thank you so much for joining me. This has been incredible. Again, my guest is Joshua Klein. He's the editor-in-chief of Mortise and Tenon Magazine. The link to check it out, buy a copy, is mortiseandtenonmag.com. And there is a link to that in the show notes in case I mangled it in the pronunciation. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron.